Welcome to Ask Psych Sessions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. This is a two-part series featuring interviews aimed at amplifying the conversation around equity, diversity, and inclusion in the classroom and in higher education. It is meant to be practical, to help everyday teachers like us identify and engage in steps toward inclusive pedagogical practices and systemic changes. No matter where you are in your understanding of equity, diversity, and inclusion, we think you will find these conversations helpful and enlightening. And now, please enjoy EDI Ask Psych Sessions with Marianne Lloyd.
Thanks for joining us. Today I'm speaking with Valerie Jones Taylor from Lehigh University. Thanks for joining us, Valerie.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get started, if you could give our listeners a bit of information about you, about your research background and the courses you teach, please.
Sure. So I am currently, as you noted, at Lehigh University. I'm in the psychology department, but I also have a joint appointment in Africana Studies there. And I study the effects of stereotyping and prejudice in academic and social contexts. And I'm specifically interested in research on interracial interactions, factors that make them go well, and factors that sometimes make them fall apart. And I'm often interested in how racial stereotypes and stereotypical group members might impact these racial interactions. I also like to really focus on ways to mitigate the discomfort that we often feel in interracial interactions when these negative racial stereotypes are salient. So I look at how friendship formation, individuation may attenuate the negative effects of that interracial interaction sometimes cause. And also, most recently, I've been interested in using virtual reality as a platform for actually training people to engage in positive interracial interactions, to really help them build their competency muscles to engage more effectively in interracial interactions.
So this VR idea, I find this so compelling. So just to be really transparent to our listeners, I reached out to you because someone on Twitter was quoting you. And they said that they had, I don't know if they heard you at a conference or in some kind of seminar, saying that, these conversations are hard and that you make the parallel to exercising. So you might not want to get up and work out your muscles. It would hurt, it would be hard. But if you wanted to see any change, then we need to continue to re-engage these conversations, just like you have to keep exercising. So then the part at the end also was that, don't give up after the first or second or third difficult conversation that you may have around race. So because I wanted us to talk in this series, maybe even a little specifically about this being a conversation in the classroom, can you, maybe just sort of use that as a jumping off point for those of us that are a little maybe out of shape in the conversation workout?
Yes. So I'll take the metaphor to its furthest extent. Okay. So we know that these conversations aren't easy every time we try to have them, especially with family members who may feel a little bit differently, students who may feel a little bit differently, people just in social interactions in the world. We know that we often feel a visceral sense of anxiety, right? We can actually feel our sort of blood sort of begin to race and things like that. And these are the same sorts of physiological and psychological feelings that we have when we want to approach something challenging to make substantive change, such as exercising or eating healthier. It's something we often don't want to do. The doctor has reminded us that we have to make changes, and we have to choose to engage in these actions. So in the same way, we may not want to or feel so comfortable about having racial or race-related conversations, especially when we feel like we're teaching a class where it's not so relevant to the topic or the content. But what we have to remember as academics is that we value deliberative practice and effort. We value the idea of an incremental mindset. These are the things that we talk to our students about either implicitly or very explicitly when they have to study for a class, do statistics practice, problem sets, and all those sorts of things. So I want to encourage us to think about having these conversations in the same way, that they take deliberative practice. And often when we start practicing, when we first get in that spin class, we can hardly make it through, right? It's very hard. The exercise is pretty painful, but we know that we have to get up at 5 a.m. 3 times a week for 2, 3, 4 months really to see the change. And then we become quite comfortable with it. It doesn't mean that it'll get super easy, right? So we can still go into a new spin class, meet a new instructor that has new standards, but we now have the training wheels on, so to speak. We know how to engage in this spin class and how to meet and rise to the challenge of our instructor. And so with these new, more challenging interracial interaction conversations, even though we may not have experience with this new person, this new topic, we have the training wheels on now that can help us in this new situation. So I hope that starts to make sense when we think about how we may want to consider to continue to re-engage in these topics.
And yeah, and maybe can you talk, I don't know if you've thought sort of through like the injury parallel, right? Because
Yes.
you're probably going to be sore, you might get bruised. And so I think that's another thing,
Yes.
to sort of talk about, like, when it doesn't go well, that doesn't necessarily mean it's you give up.
Right. Let me stop and say I teach a number of courses, but I've taught courses that more specifically relate to having race-related conversations and those that don't. So my main courses in my repertoire tend to be statistics, so intro and multivariate statistics I've taught for undergrads at different levels. I teach regularly the intro social psychology course, and I teach a seminar called The Doing and Undoing of Racism. So this last course is the course where these conversations will come up more often. But the other courses, they do arise as well, right? But often we want to shy away from them, or we just don't want to quote unquote muddy the water by bringing these things up, right? But I really want to, I know you've talked to other people, I really want to encourage the listeners to really think about diversifying their syllabus and engaging with new authors and new topics to highlight certain phenomenon that come from different perspectives. So I do this in all my classes, right? And so back to your question about exercise. Yes, we get injured when we exercise, right? We may need some physical therapy. Our muscles are very sore. We have to go drink Gatorade to get our electrolytes back up, right? And so you can imagine this idea of drinking Gatorade. It can be about the responsibility that we have, right, to read and know the literature, understand the work that we're attempting to integrate or cite, knowing that these conversations will not always go well and be willing to re-engage. We know that when we have injuries, we work through that with physical therapy. We train our muscles to get back into shape. We rest them for a short period of time, and then we re-engage. And as we know in the natural world, with our bodies, for example, we can't give up, or we may suffer the negative consequences long term. And we need to practice that same mindset in the classroom. Even if it hurts, even if it's hard, even if the students come back at you with negative comments, and I can talk a little bit more about, the negative evaluations that we may sometimes receive in protest to us attempting to talk about things of equity and justice, we have to sort of look forward towards the larger goal and kind of keep that in mind. It's like the larger goal are those 20 pounds that I have to let go of, right? So here, the larger goal is to continue to have students work and practice at becoming comfortable with engaging in these topics across our curriculum.
And do you find that your students already come in with some baseline understanding, or is some of this pretty novel? I find in my courses,
Right.
it's a mix of, some students really, walking in the room thinking that Obama meant we're post-racial. And then, certainly students, particularly my students from underrepresented groups or BIPOC populations, they're at a very different understanding, partly from lived experience. So can you
Yeah.
maybe talk about what do you do with that sort of mix of people in the room? We know that students probably on average came from a fairly segregated experience, right? Because our country is pretty racially segregated.
Yeah, so I'll start with just telling everyone a few little facts about what we know are the challenges for minority and majority students. And this is one place where all the research we do with undergrads actually tends to be really relevant to this discussion because we're teaching in classrooms where students have these concerns. So I'll highlight 4 different ways that students often come into our classrooms or want to approach conversations that center on race or racism, etc. We often hear about being colorblind, right? So we don't see color, race doesn't matter. If we don't pay attention to it, it won't exist, the problems won't continue, right? So we know that a lot of white students and their families often adopt this, not always from, or not often from a really negative point, but from a point that is rooted in this idea of wanting to be just and fair, right? So we have to know that often students' intentions may not be bad when they say the sorts of phrases that trigger this or highlight this colorblind ideology. Of course, we know that it can be really problematic for making change, for addressing racial ills. Minority students are often really put off from this ideology when we talk about perception, like we literally see color, right? So let's not ignore what we see and let's talk about it. It's not a big deal. That's often how minority students will approach it. So that's one issue. Another frame is what some people call Anglo conformity, that the issue is that we just need to adopt a European or Anglo-Western framework. And if people do that, things will be okay. And so this is sort of the mindset that some people come in with. Often minority students will adopt a multiculturalism mindset where there are many differences. These differences should be celebrated. We can talk about them. It's not a bad thing to call people Black or Latinx or white. It is the way of the world, and we can address it and move forward with it positively. Again, this sort of pushes back against this colorblind ideology, would suggest that we should not see or say anything about it, right? And one of the last ways is this idea that some people call whites' responsibility. And often minority students who can be a little frustrated and sometimes angry and really want to go into this conversation talking about what is the fault of white people, white privilege. And of course, this can really put other students and professors off in a classroom as well. And so I just highlight these things because we have to know that there's a mix of students, as you noted, that come into the classroom. And it comes from our socialization. We know by 10 or 11 years, kids don't no longer want to talk about race. We see this in psychological studies. They literally will say everything else about a person except their race, when the most efficient way to talk about someone would say, oh, it's an African American or a Black person here. And we know that parents don't want to talk about it at all. But recent research shows by Sylvia Perry shows that when parents do it, even when they're really uncomfortable, kids pick up on this, and this will reduce their implicit bias, right? So all of these things kind of come in our classrooms, and minority and white students often have different concerns and goals when they're talking about this, right? So this is a lot of research by Jennifer Richardson and Nicole Shelton that shows that white students often don't want to be seen as prejudiced, and they really want to be liked. So their goal is to be liked in these cross-race conversations. While minority students and Black students in particular, their concerns and goals are quite different. They don't want to be stereotyped, and what they desire is to be respected. Okay, so we have all these complex things going on in the classroom, and I think it's important for us as professors to know this because we can see our students dealing and struggling with these ideologies, these goals, and these concerns as they're having and talking about these kind of conversations. So knowing that, we should be really clear about the ground rules that we set in our classes to create comfortable conversations, quote unquote comfortable. They will be hard, but to make sure that people can be respectful of each other as we embark upon these difficult topics at times.
That's really terrific. And I think it gives just such like a nice, when you're walking in, to just sort of have those facts that you just covered about what's likely to happen and about the average goal of the people in the room. Because I would just, predict that some things that white people do to be likable actually work against respecting,
yes.
right? And so there's like this active, so, I can see myself the next time I teach my research methods class really just putting that on the table as a factor in the room, and that, likability. We do read the American Psychologist article by Daryl Sue
about microaggressions,
about conversations about race, and so that does sort of give a little bit more information, but not in that way that you just described as explicitly. Certainly did say that silence is not helpful for being likable.
So I have one quick example to highlight that for listeners. So you can imagine a person who has a strong internal motivation to not be prejudiced, right? They really care about these issues, a white student. And if we did a scale, they would rate low in prejudice. And these are values that they hold quite dear. Now you can imagine when they're in the conversation with, say, a Black person, they are quite aware. They have access, right, to their own psychology, but I don't, right? So they could be quite calm and cool and quite aloof in a conversation with a Black student because they know that they're not prejudiced. But some research has suggested that Black students actually interpret that as being more prejudiced in a conversation, right? Because they are not really actively monitoring how they're behaving. While students who are higher in rated prejudice, quote unquote, they actually come off as more likable because they're monitoring their behavior. They're actively trying not to look prejudiced. And so these are ways in which these conversations and our behaviors can actually backfire and belie our true underlying feelings.
Oh, that's so, and it's right, without some of those scales, because I would just guess that sort of response comes out of plenty of aloof, perfectly prejudiced conversations that the Black students have had in their lives, right? So aloofness has previously been correlated with, forthcoming microaggressions or macroaggressions, right?
Right.
Oh, wow, that's really, all right, very helpful. Is there anything else you would like to sort of leave our listeners with in terms of?
I'll say a few other things. So I think that, so for instance, when I teach statistics and I talk about correlations, there are many examples that I can provide. So, we like to talk about spurious correlations and third variables and all sorts of other things. But I like to throw in a mix of them. And so when people talk about diversifying the syllabus, people often say, well, how in the world could we do that in something like statistics or research methods, right? And so what I'll do is add in correlations both historically and more contemporary correlations and things like that. So, for example, there's a correlation that in I believe it's the 20s or 30s, something like, in the 1800s, when the price of cotton decreased, we see that lynchings actually increased, right? So it is in the early 1900s. So after the emancipation. So I use examples like this to get the conversation started. And then I can also give more recent statistics about prisons and school rates and things like this that students can kind of grapple with and think about. I don't only give those examples. I give a broad array, but I think that's important because what we want to model is that this sort of information and work is normal. We integrate it in our curriculum. We don't have to always think of it as a special topic because it is not a special topic. It is a topic that is related to our country and the founding of it and the way in which we understand economics today and psychology today. So I often make a point not to uphold something as if it's special and different and just unique, because sort of that exceptionalism can really upset students. We see that in the world, but just add it in as part of our conversation and how we want to understand the world and think about numbers and quantitative methods, things like that. So that's one thing I wanted to say. I also wanted to highlight the fact that we can diversify our assignments to teach these tough topics as well. So in my recent course, The Doing and Undoing of Racism, I spend the whole first half of the semester interrogating and thinking about how prejudice and discrimination and racism comes to be. So things about our cognition, our perception, our stereotyping, things like that, and our attitudes and behavior. And in the second half of the course, we talk about all of the social psychological interventions that have been used to mitigate these outcomes. So we talk about perspective taking, different applications in virtual reality. We talk about interracial friendships, and a host of other sort of a survey of topics. And we talk about the efficacy of these things and how well they work or what needs to be improved. And what I do, because the course could be really heavy, I have students do a series of different experiential learning activities that help them, I like to call it, help them get into fictional worlds through virtual reality and through comics. So as we talk about some of these ideas, I have students engage in a series of race-related virtual reality simulations that are supposed to help them engage in perspective taking and learning of history. So on a lot of our campuses, we now have access. Well, the COVID situation makes things a little more challenging, but we're going to just hope that things improve in the next few years as our technology continues to improve. But students get into a series, I have them do a series of virtual reality simulations where they can experience the day in the life of someone. They can go through a world. They can talk to different characters, hear them talk about their lives, and just sort of have this visceral experience. In the VR world, they call it a sense of self-presence and social presence that really makes you feel like you're there experiencing it. And then we come back and we talk about that. They really enjoy being able to experience these topics in real time that we're talking about in research. Another thing that I like to do is have them create a 15 to 30 panel comic that we use with different software that detail either the historical or psychological processes that contribute to race and racism. And they can apply it to any topic. So some students do food insecurity. Some students attach it to the medical context, to education. And then they come up with their characters, they write a little script, and they walk us through the life of a person or a series of people as they are experiencing these processes, overlaying psychology within it. And then they present it to the class. So they teach the class about how these processes can be applied to these other contexts. And I've seen, after doing this a couple of times, that it really helps students, especially those who are most concerned about talking about these topics, really get into it and engage with it in a way that can help them open their minds to learning and reduce their defensiveness. And so I highlight these and these activities because I think we really need to be creative and exploit technology and access that we have on college campuses to all these sorts of tools to help students really learn. And these things will become more important if we're doing more things online, right? We can still have students engage in some of these first or third person activities online through the comics and all these things, even if we're not in person in the fall.
Thank you. Those are great ideas and activities. And, really, like you said, it really brings everything together, right? Kind of the individuals, people that come into the room, that there may be points of conflict that this can help break them down. And I predict they find more enjoyable than writing a research paper, which you could also do on food insecurity.
Yes.
But the comic sounds so much better. And also, I mean, I don't know this, but I would just assume that there's something about doing that versus writing a paper that might help students see this as less of just a thing and more as an individual human's that are experiencing this, which
Yes.
I don't know if you've noticed that, but
I do. And so I have students do both, right? So of course they do write something at the end, but I really want them to think critically about how to explain these issues to a lay audience, to their parents, to their grandparents. And I think the comic helps with that. So I do that as their midterm assessment. So it is high stakes. So they have to give me drafts. We talk through it. We workshop it. They have a very detailed rubric to ensure that it is not fluff, but it helps them. And I force them to do it all within 30 panels or less because I want to model, we have to be concise. We have to be clear. And we have to talk about these issues. And so I've encouraged them to not only do it for the class, but to go and show their parents and their siblings. And that we've gotten really good feedback and results with these sorts of activities. So,
well, thank you so much. I think that our, listeners, whether they're already doing some of this work, ready to level up, or if they're just getting started, you've given them a lot of great pieces of information to work with. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And don't give up.